Frank Mallerie, a former Green Beret, lives alone in the New Mexico desert, digging daily to find Reggie Campbell, his brother-in-arms left behind in Laos in 1971. Locals call him the Desert Ghost, dismissing his quest. Undeterred, Frank clings to a promise, digging through decades of silence. One morning, an F-16 roars overhead, circling him. Has the military noticed? Will the truth buried for 50 years surface? Or will Frank's search remain a solitary mission? The desert holds secrets, and Frank's shovel might just uncover what the world forgot. Thank you for watching Frank's moving story of loyalty. Please like, subscribe, and share to spread meaningful stories. Comment about a promise you've kept. Support our channel to keep inspiring tales alive. Join us to honor heroes like Frank who carry promises in silence. The desert stretched endlessly before Frank Mallerie, its silence so profound it seemed to choke the very air, especially in the blistering heat of August. The ground, cracked and brittle like an old man's bones, burned under the merciless midday sun, sending shimmers of heat dancing across the horizon. Frank worked alone, his hands trembling with age but steady with purpose, clutching a spade as if it were an extension of his will. No tourists ventured to this forsaken stretch of New Mexico high desert. No cameras snapped to capture its stark beauty, just the oppressive heat and a quiet that felt alive with secrets. In Sage Hollow, the nearest town, folks whispered about him, their voices tinged with pity and scorn. They called him the Desert Ghost, a madman chasing shadows in the sand. But that morning, as he paused to wipe the sweat from his weathered brow, he spoke to the earth in a low, reverent murmur. "I'll find it, Reggie," he said, his voice thick with a grief that had never softened. "I owe you that much. At the very least, a candle in this damn dirt to mark your name." The words were a prayer, a promise carved into the silence. Then a roar tore through the sky, an F-16 fighter jet, its screams slicing the stillness as it circled above. For the first time in decades, someone noticed him, a solitary figure etched against the vast emptiness. Frank Mallerie was a name forgotten by most in Sage Hollow. To the few who still saw him, he was a specter, slipping into town to buy canned chili and black coffee before retreating to the desert's embrace. He lived in a 1972 Winnebago, its paint chipped and faded, parked in a forgotten corner near the rusted skeleton of an old military testing site. The RV was rooted to the earth, its tires sinking into the sand as if the desert were claiming it inch by inch. Above the cracked windshield, a faded American flag hung limp, too worn to dance in the rare breeze, much like Frank himself. At 78, he stood tall but stooped, his shoulders curved under the weight of years, each one pressing down like a stone. His skin was tough as leather baked by decades under the sun, his white beard a wild, untamed tangle. His eyes, though, were what stopped you. They didn't blink like most men's did. They held a quiet weight, a depth that carried the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken stories, not of fear or anger, but of a burden he'd carried so long it had become part of him. Once, Frank had worn the Green Beret, part of a unit so secret it existed only in the shadows. Lancer 7, they called it, a special forces team dropped into the jungles of Laos when the government swore no Americans were there. Their missions were brutal in their simplicity. Map the enemy's movements, observe their positions, destroy what needed to be destroyed, and vanish without a trace. No witnesses, no medals, no proof. Frank never spoke of those days, not to the curious or the kind. The memories were a vault, locked tight, but if someone had earned his trust, he might have shared a piece of Reggie Campbell. Reggie was more than a soldier. He was a brother, hailing from Alabama with a laugh that could pierce the tension of a fire base and a harmonica always tucked in his pocket, its notes a fleeting comfort in the chaos. 3 years younger than Frank, Reggie was sharper than most sergeants, with a focus that never faltered, even when bullets screamed through the air. In the jungle, he was a rock, quick, calm, the kind of man who could face death and not blink. But the jungle didn't care about courage. Their final mission together was a wound that never healed. The helicopter meant to pull them out took a hit, its rotors choking on smoke as anti-aircraft fire tore through the sky. Reggie stayed back, holding the line so Frank could board first. Frank could still see it, Reggie's silhouette running through the haze, only to be cut down by shrapnel before he could reach the chopper. The order came, cold and final. Leave him. No retrieval, no second chances. Frank didn't argue, didn't scream. He followed orders as he'd been trained, but something inside him shattered, a fracture that grew deeper with every passing year. It wasn't just guilt, it was a debt, a promise unkept, a piece of his soul left behind in the jungle. After the war, Frank tried to outrun his ghosts. He settled in El Paso for a time, working at a hardware store, but the normalcy felt like a prison. He married once, a fleeting attempt at a life that wasn't his. It fell apart quickly, leaving nothing but echoes of what could have been. Eventually, he took the Winnebago and drove west until the pavement ended, the desert swallowing him whole. That's where he stayed, bound to its vastness. Every morning, just before dawn, he'd lace up his cracked jungle boots, grab his spade, and step into the desert's embrace. The air was cooler then, the silence cleaner before the sun's relentless assault. He'd walk 50 yards from the RV, open a worn leather pouch filled with hand-drawn maps, grids he'd sketched and refined over years, and begin to dig. Some days, he'd carve out 2 feet of earth. Others, he'd go as deep as 6. On the worst days, the wind whipped sand into his eyes, stinging until he had to stop. But he always returned. The desert was his confessor, his judge, his only witness. No one knew what he sought. Locals spun stories. Some said he was after buried treasure. Others whispered of aliens, fueled by a YouTube kid chasing clout. Most just assumed he was a broken vet, his mind lost in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But Frank knew, and the desert knew too. Every so often, he'd unearth fragments. Nothing grand, just pieces of a past he could never fully reclaim, a debt he could never fully repay. In the blistering desert, Frank Mallerie knelt in the parched earth, his weathered hands combing through the dust for traces of a man he couldn't let go. Each fine, a frayed scrap of canvas, a corroded belt buckle, or a sliver of metal bearing faint, faded numbers, stirred a quiet ache in his chest, a fragile thread connecting him to a promise unbroken. He'd shut his eyes, the world falling away, and whisper, voice rough with devotion, "I'll find you, Reggie. I swore I would." Those words were his anchor, a sacred vow to a man who'd been his brother in all but blood. Standing, he clutched his shovel, its handle worn smooth by years of searching, and felt the weight of that promise settle deep in his bones, a burden he carried willingly, a purpose that kept him moving. Sage Hollow saw him as a specter, a man who drifted in and out like a mirage. He'd step into the store, dust clinging to his boots, and speak only what was necessary to gather supplies: coffee, canned goods, gloves to replace the ones torn by thorns and time. Then he'd be gone, melting back into the desert's embrace. To some, he was a figure to pity, his solitude mistaken for a wound too deep to heal. Others kept their distance, unsettled by the fire in his gaze, the way it seemed to pierce through the present to a place they couldn't follow. But a handful, the elders, whose own hearts bore the marks of unhealed loss, saw him clearly. They'd offer a silent nod, knowing the kind of grief that doesn't ask for solace but demands action. Frank didn't seek their approval or their tears. He didn't want fame or gratitude. He wanted only to keep his word, to bring Reggie home, even if it was just a fragment of him. Each evening, he'd set a lone candle in the dirt, its flame a defiant spark against the night. And every dawn, he'd stride into the dust, shovel in hand, bearing his promise like a standard no one else could see. The world had long since forgotten Reggie Campbell, his name lost to the pages of a war it preferred to ignore. But Frank's memory burned bright. In 1971, in the suffocating jungles of Southeast Asia, Frank was no desert wanderer. He was a soldier, wiry, alert, and fueled by the reckless courage of a man who hadn't yet learned how much war could take. As a member of Lancer 7, a Phantom Special Forces unit that existed only in whispers, he operated in a conflict the U.S. denied. Their missions in Laos, a stone's throw from Vietnam, were off the books, their failures inadmissible. Their orders were deceptively simple: drop into enemy territory, monitor troop movements, disrupt supplies, and call in strikes. But the jungle was a labyrinth of roots and shadows. and the enemy was a ghost that knew every path. Lancer 7 worked in small crews, 5 or 6 men bound by trust and necessity, with no reinforcements and often no radio lifeline. The silence of those empty airwaves was a pressure in itself, a reminder that survival depended on each other. In that void, Reggie Campbell was Frank's constant. Reggie, with his Alabama drawl and easy grin, could lighten even the darkest nights with tales of Dothan's dusty streets. But in battle, he was a different man, swift, precise, and utterly fearless. He didn't brag or pose. His actions spoke louder than words. When a man fell, Reggie was there, dragging him to cover without a second thought. To Frank, Reggie was more than a partner. He was a brother, their bonds sealed in shared trenches in Kassan and makeshift camps near Bonfano. They'd faced ambushes together, sewn each other's wounds, and once endured a 6-hour standoff with an enemy patrol just 10 yards away, their silence a language of its own. A look was all it took to know the other's mind. They were a unit, inseparable. But war spares no one, and for Frank and Reggie, the end came in March 1971 on a mission that would haunt Frank forever. Lancer 7 was sent to scout a valley near Ziphone, Laos, to confirm reports of an enemy weapons cache. The briefing promised minimal resistance, a routine sweep, but the intel was a lie. They dropped in at night, their parachutes whispering through the humid air. And by noon, they were caught in a meticulously planned ambush. North Vietnamese troops had been waiting, their trap too precise to be chance. The jungle became a cacophony, not just of gunfire and grenades, but of trees cracking under relentless fire and the radio's useless static as they begged for rescue. Frank's pulse thundered as they shouted for exfil, the words of prayer against the odds. The chopper arrived, its blades churning the heavy air, struggling to find a landing zone in the chaos. Frank and Reggie held the rear, covering their team's desperate sprint. Bullets tore through the foliage, branches raining down. 2 men fell, their screams lost in the roar. Frank and Reggie hauled them to the helicopter, pain deferred by adrenaline. Frank climbed aboard, gripping the skids, his lungs burning. He reached for Reggie, who was right behind, his eyes fierce with resolve. Their fingers brushed, then a blinding flash. A rocket struck the chopper's tail, the explosion slamming Frank against the frame. The helicopter shuddered, fighting to rise. Through the haze, Frank's gaze met Reggie's, a heartbeat of connection in the madness. Then the chopper surged upward, and Reggie vanished, claimed by the jungle, and a war that would never return him. The impact hurled Frank forward, the jolt rattling his bones as the helicopter shuddered violently. He twisted in his seat, heart pounding, eyes searching the chaos behind him. Reggie was gone. Just gone. The jungle's greedy maw had swallowed him whole, its dense green tangle erasing his silhouette in an instant. The chopper lurched upward, engine screaming, guzzling fuel as it fought to stay airborne. Through the crackling headset, the pilot's voice cut through the static, sharp and frantic, relaying commands from some distant authority. Then came the words that would haunt Frank for decades. "We can't go back. Mission terminated. We're pulling out." Frank's world collapsed into those words. He roared, his voice raw with desperation, pleading, cursing, begging for them to turn back. Reggie was down there, somewhere in that suffocating jungle, and they were leaving him. But the chopper was a wounded beast, its rotor damaged, coughing black smoke. The wounded men on board groaned, their blood pooling on the metal floor. The jungle below was a death trap, a labyrinth of danger that promised no survivors. The choice was made, not by Frank, but by the cold calculus of survival. Lancer 7 limped back to base, battered but alive. Reggie didn't. Back at the base, the sterile ritual of paperwork began. The mission was labeled inconclusive, a vague term that hid more than it revealed. The location was blacked out, reduced to redacted lines on a classified report. Reggie Campbell's name didn't even earn the dignity of killed in action. Instead, he was marked unrecoverable, a bureaucratic footnote in a file destined to gather dust in some locked cabinet. No funeral was held, no flag was folded, no call was made to his family, no explanation offered for the void left in their lives. Frank carried the weight of that silence like a stone in his chest. He never forgave the system for it, the faceless machine that erased his friend, his brother, without so much as a whisper of remorse. Soldiers are trained to stay quiet, to swallow their pain and move on. Frank tried. God, he tried. But something inside him festered, a slow rot that gnawed at his soul. 6 months later, he walked away from the service. No grand farewell, no ceremonial speech or parade. He simply left the base one day, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped into a world that no longer made sense. He carried no mementos, no photos, no stories to share over beers. What he carried was heavier, a promise screamed into a sky choked with smoke. I'll find you, Reggie. I swear to God, I will. Those words burned in him, a vow etched into his very being, unyielding even as the years piled on. The war ended, presidents came and went, new conflicts flared and faded. The world spun forward, indifferent, but Frank couldn't move on. Reggie was with him always, not in tangible things like letters or dog tags, but in the weight of that promise, a debt he couldn't repay but couldn't abandon. It followed him through 30 years of wandering, through aching joints that creaked in the cold, through lungs that wheezed in the winter air. It followed him through the skeptical glances of strangers and the isolation of a life unmoored. Reggie wasn't just a friend lost to the jungle, he was a brother, and some debts a man carries until his last breath. When Frank stepped off the plane in 1972, the war was supposed to be over. The uniform came off, the discharge papers were signed, but peace remained a stranger. He tried to follow the advice everyone gave him. Get it go. Settle down. Blend in. For a brief spell, he worked behind the counter at a hardware store in El Paso, measuring out nails and paint cans for customers who never looked him in the eye. He rented a small one-bedroom apartment near the train yard, its walls thin enough to hear the rumble of passing freights. He kept to himself, standing in line for coffee like any other man, trying to convince himself he could be ordinary. But at night, the rotors still thrummed in his dreams. Reggie's silhouette still vanished into the jungle's haze. 3 months was all he could manage before he walked away, leaving the keys on the counter and his final paycheck unclaimed. After that, Frank drifted. Arizona's deserts, Nevada's neon-lit nights, Utah's quiet mountains, Colorado's wide-open plains. He tried them all. Big cities, small towns, places so remote the stars felt close enough to touch. He sought solace in church pews, hoping for answers in the stained glass, and oblivion in barrooms, chasing forgetfulness in the bottom of a glass. He took whatever work he could find, hauling crates in warehouses, mending fences on ranches, digging post holes in forgotten corners of the country where even the dogs were too tired to bark. Nothing held him. People tried to reach him, kind as strangers, lonely souls, a few women who saw something worth saving in his guarded eyes. But Frank couldn't stay. His past was shrapnel lodged beneath his skin, jagged and unreachable, and no amount of kindness could dislodge it. He wasn't fleeing his life. He was searching for Reggie's. The turning point came with a map, not a military grid, but a worn road atlas he bought at a gas station outside Flagstaff. One night in a diner bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, Frank sat hunched over its creased pages. His coffee grew cold as he traced the lines of a long-ago mission, piecing together fragments of memory. Coordinates, elevation, tree lines, wind patterns, the proximity of a base that never officially existed. The names on the map were fake, cloaked in secrecy, but the land itself didn't lie. Every ridge, every curve of the hills pointed to one place, southern New Mexico. A dry basin near a site once used for classified training and weapons testing, the kind of place that never appeared on tourist maps but lingered in rumors. A restricted zone where the fences had rusted away, but the ghosts remained. Frank's heart raced as the realization hit. Reggie wasn't lost in some far-off jungle in Laos or Vietnam. He was here on American soil, buried beneath 50 years of silence and secrecy. There was no hesitation. Frank bought a used 1972 Winnebago Brave, its faded paint and creaking frame a fitting companion for a man chasing ghosts. He didn't know what he'd find, answers, closure, or just more questions. But he knew he had to go. The promise he'd made in that smoke-filled sky still burned, undimmed by time. And Frank Mallerie wasn't a man to break his word. In the vast sun-scorched expanse of the desert near Las Cruces, Frank Mallerie carved out a solitary existence, his life tethered to a rusted Winnebago parked where the pavement surrendered to gravel and the gravel dissolved into endless sand. He had packed the vehicle with the bare essentials, stacks of canned food, dented gas cans, and a collection of old army tools, their handles worn smooth by years of use. There was no farewell to mark his departure, no tearful goodbyes or lingering glances. Frank simply turned south and drove until the world fell away, until the horizon was nothing but a shimmering promise of solitude. When he finally stopped, he stepped out, shovel in hand, and began to dig. There was no blueprint, no grand design, just the steady rhythm of his shovel biting into the earth, a quiet vow etched into every scoop of red soil. Each morning, Frank rose with the sun, his body stiff from the desert's cold nights, his mind heavy with a purpose he carried like a stone in his chest. He'd sling a hand compasser around his neck, its cracked glass catching the light, and walk 50 to 60 yards from the Winnebago, his boots crunching against the parched ground. The desert stretched out before him, a boundless sea of cracked earth and whispering winds, its vastness enough to swallow most men whole. To others, it was emptiness, a barren wasteland where dreams went to die. But to Frank, it was a canvas of possibility, a place where the past could be unearthed, where a promise could be kept. He divided the land into invisible grids, each one a silent contract between him and the earth. He'd dig until the soil grew stubborn, or the wind whipped up clouds of stinging dust, forcing him to pause, shift his flags, and start again 10 feet to the side. The work was relentless, but so was he. Frank didn't need anyone's approval or assistance. He didn't even need hope, though it flickered faintly in his chest like a candle in a storm. What he had was something stronger, a promise, sacred and unyielding, that tethered him to this desolate place. To the few locals in Sage Hollow, a dusty town of just over 600 souls, Frank was an enigma, a weathered figure who appeared once a month to buy supplies and vanish without a word. They didn't know his name or his story, only the sight of his battered Winnebago rolling into town, its engine coughing like an old man's lungs. Whispers swirled among the townsfolk, each theory more colorful than the last. Some pegged him as ex-military, his rigid posture and clipped movements betraying a soldier's discipline, now frayed by time or trauma. Others swore the desert heat had unraveled his mind, leaving him to chase delusions in the sand. A few romantics imagined he was hunting for gold, one of those grizzled treasure seekers chasing legends of lost Spanish riches or ancient maps leading to secret tunnels. But no one ever asked him directly, not really, and Frank didn't care what they thought. Each time his shovel struck the earth, he heard Reggie's voice, clear as the day they had last spoke. "You better not give up on me, brother." And Frank would answer, his voice rough and low, speaking to the wind, "I'm still here." The years wore on, marked by blazing summers that baked the earth until it cracked, and bitter winters that gnawed at his bones. Frank endured it all. He patched leaks in the Winnebago's roof with his own hands, the task a small act of defiance against the desert's relentless assault. Twice he wrestled the radiator back to life, cursing under his breath as he worked, his fingers stained with grease and grit. One year, the heat nearly claimed him, stripping 20 pounds from his already lean frame, leaving him gaunt but unbroken. Another time, a coyote tore through his food supply, scattering cans and leaving claw marks in the sand. Frank chased it off with a rusted crowbar, his shouts echoing in the empty expanse, only to collapse into laughter, the first in months. When the animal vanished into the dusk, it was a fleeting moment of lightness, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. Alone, yes, but not abandoned. Somewhere beneath the sand lay a man he'd sworn never to leave behind, and that vow held him upright when everything else threatened to pull him under. In Sage Hollow, life moved slowly, the days blurring into one another like the heat waves on the horizon. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to Frank's quiet presence, his monthly visits as predictable as the sunrise. They didn't know his name or the weight he carried, only that he was the old man who drove in, bought his canned goods and left without fanfare. Gossip filled the gaps their curiosity couldn't bridge. At the diner, over coffee gone cold, some swore he was a war veteran, his mind fractured by battles fought long ago. Others speculated he was a doomsday prepper, carving out a bunker in case the world unraveled. The teenagers were less kind. A group of them once trailed him from town, their phones raised like weapons, filming as he dug in the desert's heart. They uploaded the clip with a mocking title, "Desert Grandpa Digs for Aliens," and it spread just enough to draw chuckles from strangers who'd never know the truth behind his silence. In the video, Frank never looked up, never flinched. He just kept digging, one measured scoop at a time. His focus a wall no cruelty could breach. Not everyone was callous. There were those in Sage Hollow who sensed something deeper in Frank's solitude, even if they couldn't name it. Nancy, the woman who ran the general store, always slipped an extra bottle of water into his bag, her fingers quick and discreet, never asking for thanks or payment. Harold, the town's retired mechanic, would occasionally leave a box of canned chili by the fence near Frank's usual parking spot, a quiet offering he never acknowledged aloud. These weren't acts of pity, but of respect. Small gestures of dignity extended to a man whose purpose they didn't understand but couldn't ignore. They saw the lines etched into his face, the weariness in his shoulders, and knew there was a story there, one he wasn't ready to tell. Frank's life was a rhythm of shovel strikes and silent promises. Each hole he dug a prayer, each bead of sweat a tribute to a brother lost but not forgotten. He wasn't chasing gold or myths or madness. He was reaching for Reggie, for the day when he could look down into the earth and say, "There you are." Most people spend their final years slowing down, settling into the comfort of routine. Frank Mallerie spent his digging toward a memory, toward a vow that burned brighter than the desert sun. He didn't know if that day would ever come, but he knew he'd be ready when it did. And in the quiet of Sage Hollow, where whispers spun stories and truths went unspoken, Frank kept digging, not for treasure, but for something far more sacred, the chance to bring his brother home. The desert stretched endlessly before Frank Mallerie's RV, a barren expanse where the wind, now hushed after its pre-dawn howl, seemed to carry whispers of forgotten promises. The air was dry, slicing through his weathered skin, but the early light draped the landscape in a fleeting softness, a rare kindness before the sun's relentless blaze consumed it. Frank stepped out into the stillness, his boots crunching against the parched earth, the rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. At 72, his body moved slower, joints creaking with every step, each ache a reminder of time's unyielding march. Yet the fire that had burned in him for 50 years still smoldered, undimmed by age or doubt. In his hand, the old compass swung gently against his chest, its needle steady as ever, while the shovel slung over his shoulder felt like an extension of himself, a tool of duty, of devotion. He chose a new grid that morning, 10 feet east of the previous week's dig. The ground here was different, looser, as if it had been disturbed long ago and left to settle under decades of heat and wind. Frank knew the signs. He'd studied the Earth's secrets, learned how it hid the scars of violence beneath layers of dust and time. His hands, calloused but steady, gripped the shovel as he began to dig, slicing through the soil with the precision of a surgeon. Each scoop was deliberate, his eyes scanning the dirt for any hint of the past. The desert was silent, save for the faint scrape of metal against earth, until a sound stopped him cold. A faint, unmistakable crunch, unlike the usual clink of rock or thud of packed dirt. His heart lurched, a sudden jolt of hope and dread colliding in his chest. Dropping to his knees, Frank set the shovel aside and began brushing away the dirt with his bare hands, fingers trembling as they moved with the reverence of a man uncovering a sacred relic. The earth yielded slowly, revealing a tattered fragment of cloth, bleached by years under the merciless sun, but still bearing the unmistakable weave of military fabric. Beneath it, half buried and corroded by time, lay a metal insignia, its edges warped by heat but intact. And there, etched faintly beneath a veil of rust, was a name, Campbell. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat as the world around him seemed to collapse inward. The desert, vast and indifferent, faded into a blur, and in its place rose memories of a jungle 50 years ago, humid, chaotic, choked with smoke and screams. Reggie Campbell, his closest friend, his brother in arms, had vanished in that chaos, swallowed by an explosion that left nothing but questions and a void in Frank's soul. For half a century, Frank had carried that loss, a weight heavier than any shovel, a wound that never healed. Now, holding the insignia in both hands, he felt the years peel away, each one a layer of grief and resolve. His lips quivered as he whispered, "I told you I'd find you." The words were raw, torn from a place deep within, a vow kept through decades of solitary searches. I never stopped looking. Tears came then, not the loud, wrenching sobs of youth, but a quiet, steady stream that carved clean tracks through the dust on his face. He didn't collapse or wail. He simply sat there, the shovel resting beside him, shoulders trembling as he clutched the insignia to his chest. It was as if the desert itself held its breath, honoring the reunion of two soldiers separated by time and tragedy. Frank's mind swirled with memories of Reggie's easy laugh, his unshakable courage, the way he'd promised they'd make it home together. That promise had shattered in the jungle, but Frank had made another one, to find him no matter how long it took. Now, as he knelt in the dirt, he felt the weight of that vow lift, if only slightly, replaced by a bittersweet ache of fulfillment and loss. Unbeknownst to Frank, his solitary mission had not gone unnoticed. For nearly 6 months, a low-level Pentagon surveillance program had been quietly monitoring heat and motion data across old military training bones, relics of a bygone era scattered across the desert. Frank's relentless digging, methodical yet obsessive, had raised flags among analysts sifting through streams of data. His patterns, daily treks to precise grids, hours spent turning over Earth, had triggered anomalies, but the reports were dismissed as the quirks of a harmless old man. Likely a prospector, one analyst had noted, closing the file. But that morning something shifted. A junior officer at White Sands, bleary-eyed from hours of staring at thermal readouts, noticed a change. A prolonged pause in Frank's usual grid, followed by a brief, erratic burst of movement. It was the kind of signal that suggested discovery, the kind that spoke of someone unearthing something they weren't prepared for. The officer hesitated, his finger hovering over the console. This wasn't just another data point. It felt personal, urgent. He made a call, off the record, to a supervisor who trusted his instincts. The response was swift but discreet, a ripple moving up the chain of command. 20 minutes later, the desert sky roared to life. Frank, still kneeling with the insignia in his hands, looked up, squinting against the rising sun. A gray streak sliced across the horizon, sharp and deliberate. An F-16, not a routine flyby or a wayward patrol. It circled low, its engines a steady growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth. Frank's instincts, honed by years in uniform, kicked in. He stood, his back straightening as if he were still a young soldier reporting for duty, and shielded his eyes to watch the jet carve a wide arc above him. Once, twice it circled, its movements precise, almost ceremonial, as if marking the ground where he stood. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's orders were vague: confirm human activity in Sector 27B, report visual, do not engage. But as he tilted the jet for a better view, he saw something that made his breath catch. A lone figure, elderly but resolute, standing in the middle of nowhere, clutching what looked like dog tags to his chest. The pilot's training told him to stay detached, to report and move on, but the sight stirred something deeper, a quiet respect for the man below. He didn't speak into the comms, didn't break protocol with unnecessary chatter. He simply kept circling, his eyes fixed on Frank, as if bearing witness to a moment too sacred to interrupt. Back at the Pentagon, satellite imagery was already painting a clearer picture. Analysts huddled over screens, piecing together fragments of data that pointed to an undocumented crash site from 1971, a mission scrubbed from official records, buried under layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. For years, whispers of that lost flight had circulated among old-timers, but no one had believed it would ever resurface. Now Frank's discovery had changed everything. The chain of command moved quickly, though quietly, to avoid drawing attention. A forensic recovery team was dispatched, their orders clear: secure the site, retrieve any remains, and uncover the truth of what had been lost in that desert half a century ago. As the team mobilized, the desert held its secrets close. But Frank, standing alone with Reggie's name in his hands, had already begun to unravel them. Under the pretense of a routine Air Force survey, Frank Mallerie received his orders without ceremony. No headlines, no press, just a quiet command to act. His task was to journey to the designated site, recover what remained, and uncover truths long hidden. Alone in the sprawling desert, Frank stood still, his gaze locked on the horizon where the sky melted into twilight. His fingers brushed the worn dog tag before tucking it into his shirt pocket, his breath a shaky release of years spent wrestling with an uncertainty. Doubt clawed at him. Would anyone respond to his discovery? Would the military bury this truth again, as they had with Reggie Campbell, his brother in arms? Yet, beneath his weathered exterior, Frank felt a shift, a subtle fracture in the oppressive silence that had defined his life for decades. Somewhere within the labyrinthine halls of the institution that had once turned its back on them, he sensed a listener had emerged. The morning after a jet had streaked across the sky, the desert awoke with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the earth. Frank's pulse quickened. He recognized that sound. Decades earlier, in the dense jungles of Vietnam, it had been a lifeline amid chaos. This was no echo of the past. It was present, tangible, undeniable. A Black Hawk helicopter crested the eastern hills, its blades slicing through the dawn's calm, stirring sand into swirling clouds. The dust carried with it 50 years of buried truths, 50 years of unanswered grief, 50 years of relentless waiting. Frank stood unwavering, his body slipping into the disciplined stance of a soldier. As if the year were still 1975, his boots anchored him to the earth, his posture rigid, the familiar weight of his dog tags pressed against his chest, tethering him to his purpose. In that moment, he was no longer just Frank, the old man. He was Sergeant First Class Mallerie, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As the helicopter touched down and its doors slid open, a group of soldiers emerged, their dress uniforms a sharp contrast to the desert's ruggedness. Among them, a man in his late 50s stepped forward with commanding presence. His chest gleamed with ribbons, the insignia of a general marking his rank. His boots hit the ground with a sound that seemed to ripple through the sands, a declaration of intent. He approached Frank, paused, and raised his hand in a salute heavy with respect. For a heartbeat, Frank faltered, his mind caught in a torrent of memories. Years of searching, of being ignored, of carrying Reggie's absence like a wound. Then, with a crisp motion, he returned the salute, the gesture a bridge between past and present. The general's voice cut through the stillness. Sergeant First Class Frank Mallerie, on behalf of the United States Army and the nation you served with unyielding honor, we offer our deepest gratitude and our profound regret for the decades it has taken to stand here with you. Emotion surged in Frank's chest, but he swallowed it down, responding with a slow, deliberate nod. He gestured to a patch of disturbed earth nearby, his voice low but firm. He's here, he said. Handle him with care. The recovery team set to work with meticulous care, their ground-penetrating radar and soft brushes moving in a slow, almost reverent dance under the blistering sun. Frank observed from a distance, arms folded tightly across his chest, sweat carving paths down his sun-hardened face. Each drop seemed to carry a fragment of his journey, the sleepless nights, the endless searches, the vow he'd made to Reggie under a starlit sky in a war-torn jungle. His thoughts drifted to his friend's infectious grin, the soulful notes of his harmonica, the unspoken pact to always have each other's backs. The desert's vastness pressed against him, but his world felt small, confined to the ache of memory and the hope of resolution. Just before noon, a young corporal rose, holding something in his hands with the care one might give to a fragile heirloom. Dog tags, worn and warped but still readable. Campbell, R.U.S. Army, Opio. The find sent a quiet shock through the team. Moments later, they unearthed fragments of bone, a boot sole, and tucked inside a corroded ammo pouch, a harmonica, silent but whole, a relic of a life stolen too soon. Frank turned away, his breath catching. He didn't need to see more. The truth he'd carried for 50 years was now laid bare before the world. By nightfall, the story had escaped the desert's solitude. A reporter from El Paso, alerted to the military presence, broke the news. A photograph of Frank standing beside the general flashed across local stations, then surged onto national networks. CBS, Fox, CNN. The headline reverberated nationwide. Vietnam veteran finds missing brother in arms after 50 years of solitary search. The media hailed it as a saga of unyielding determination, of loyalty that defied death, of honor that time could not erode. Calls flooded in, from senators, retired generals, old friends lost to time. Invitations arrived from Capitol Hill and the Pentagon, promising ceremonies, interviews, medals. Frank, unmoved by this clamor, had one request. He met the general's gaze and said, his voice resolute, "Let him home." A week later, Reggie Campbell's remains were flown to Dothan, Alabama, where he was laid to rest with the full honors of a nation. The ceremony was a 21-gun salute, a folded flag, the haunting melody of taps. Reggie's immediate family had long since faded, leaving only distant cousins, but the town of Dothan rallied. Veterans from every branch lined the cemetery road, their dress uniforms a testament to brotherhood. Some saluted, their hands steady despite age. Others let tears fall, their sorrow a shared bond. At the forefront stood Frank, not in formal attire or adorned with medals, but in his worn boots and the olive-drab shirt he'd worn daily for 10 years, now freshly pressed. Over his heart hung Reggie's dog tag, a quiet emblem of a vow fulfilled. As the final note of taps lingered among the trees, Frank's gaze settled on the horizon. His heart carried the weight of closure, yet it soared with the certainty that Reggie was finally at rest. The silence that had haunted him for decades had lifted, replaced by a quiet pride and a peace he hadn't felt in half a century. Under the vast, unyielding desert sun of New Mexico, the old RV stood like a sentinel, its once shiny exterior dulled by years of sand and wind. Inside, Frank Mallerie packed his few belongings with deliberate care, his hands moving with the quiet precision of a man who had spent decades carrying a weight no one else could see. For the first time in 50 years, he folded his tattered map, its creases worn thin from countless nights of tracing routes to forgotten places. His shovel, its handle smoothed by his grip, leaned against the wall, finally at rest. Frank hadn't set out to chase glory or fame. He'd set out to honor a vow, a promise made in the heat of youth and sealed in the shadow of loss. Now that promise was fulfilled, and the world felt lighter, though his heart still carried the ache of memory. Frank had never sought the spotlight. When they came to him with offers of medals, statues, and television interviews, he waved them away with a quiet shake of his head. Those things meant nothing to him. His mission had never been about recognition. It was about a name, a single name that deserved to be remembered. Reggie Campbell, a friend, a brother in arms, a man whose life had been swallowed by time and war, but whose memory Frank had carried like a sacred flame. Now Reggie's name was etched in stone, reclaimed from oblivion, and Frank could finally breathe, knowing he'd done right by the man who'd once stood beside him. On a crisp morning in Arlington National Cemetery, the sky stretched out in a brilliant, unbroken blue, the kind of clarity that seemed to hush the world below. Rows of white headstones stood in solemn formation, each one a testament to a life given in service, each one a silent guardian of stories untold. Beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak, a flag-draped casket rested, its presence drawing every eye in the crowd. Reggie Campbell had come home at last, his journey through decades of absence finally complete. The honor guard moved with a grace born of discipline, their steps measured, their breaths synchronized, as if time itself paused to honor the moment. A young Marine, his face etched with reverence, cradled the folded American flag, its stars and stripes a symbol of a debt paid in full. Frank stood apart from the dignitaries, the officers, and the flashing cameras, a solitary figure in his faded olive green dress uniform. The fabric, issued in 1971, bore the marks of time, thinned at the elbows, slightly frayed at the cuffs, but it was immaculate, pressed with care and buttoned to the collar. On his chest, where medals might have gleamed, there was only one adornment, Reggie's dog tag, pinned neatly over his heart. It was a quiet declaration, a piece of metal that carried more weight than any decoration ever could. In his hands, he held the folded flag he'd been given moments before, its triangular shape heavy with meaning. His knuckles whitened as he gripped it, as if letting go might shatter the fragile piece he'd fought so long to find. As the minister's voice rose and fell, speaking of duty, loyalty, and a sacrifice that had waited 50 years to be honored, Frank's mind drifted. He saw flashes of jungles and gunfire, heard the laughter of a young Reggie, his voice bright with dreams that would never come to pass. He felt the weight of those years spent searching, digging, hoping. Each shovelful of earth a prayer, each empty lead a wound. The promise he'd made to Reggie had been a lifeline, a tether that kept Frank moving forward when the world told him to give up. He'd carried that promise through deserts and doubts, through sleepless nights and the skepticism of others, until this moment when Reggie's name was finally spoken with the reverence it deserved. The crowd fell silent as the minister's words faded, and all eyes turned skyward. A faint hum grew into a thunderous roar as 4 F-16s sliced through the horizon, their formation tight and flawless. They soared over the cemetery, a fleeting shadow against the endless blue, and then, in a heartbeat, one jet broke away, climbing sharply to the left. The missing man formation, a tribute as old as the skies themselves, marked the absence of a warrior, a life lost but not forgotten. The crowd watched, breathless, as the lone jet vanished into the distance, its absence a mirror to the hole Reggie had left behind. But Frank didn't look up. He didn't need to see the sky to feel the weight of that moment. Instead, he whispered, his voice barely audible, "Took me half a lifetime, buddy, but I kept my word." The words were for himself, for Reggie, for the bond that had outlasted war and time. Frank closed his eyes, letting the moment settle into his bones. He didn't crave applause or headlines. He didn't want his name carved in stone or splashed across screens. All he'd ever wanted was this: one grave, one name restored, one promise kept. As the crowd began to drift away, their murmurs fading into the wind, Frank remained by the headstone. He stood tall, unwavering, like a soldier still at his post. No tears fell, no words spilled from his lips. He simply stood, the flag still clasped in his hands, as the breeze stirred the leaves above and the last F-16 disappeared beyond the clouds. Some stories don't blaze across front pages or trend in fleeting headlines. They unfold in the quiet places, in windswept deserts where a lone man with a shovel keeps a promise the world has long forgotten. Frank Mallerie didn't fight for recognition or glory. He fought for memory, for loyalty, for a friend whose name deserved to endure. In a world that races forward, where loyalty can feel like a relic and honor a forgotten art, Frank's story is a quiet reminder that some debts are paid in silence, one determined step at a time. His life was a testament to something enduring, something this world could use more of: honor.